this is a ministry that you can probably do for your entire life, being involved in helping resettle people. And frankly, you can't get more biblical than that. The story of Israel is the story of refugees coming to you. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. On the first Sunday in Lent, which is what we are on, the church tends to do two things. One is pretty much universal, and the other is pretty regular across Episcopal churches. The first is across pretty much every denomination, we read the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. So this year we read from Luke, next year will be Matthew, and the following year Mark, and we sort of rotate through. In many, but not all, Episcopal churches, we also begin the season of Lent with the Great Litany, and for what it's worth, the rest of Lent we will begin the service with the penitential rite. So this is the one and only opportunity for the litany. You can pray it on your own anytime you want. I'm grateful that we have two different versions of it that we get to pray. The first, at the Rite 1 service on Lent 1 at 8 o'clock, we say it and kneel while saying it. At the Rite 2 service, the choir sings it, and they're both wonderful, but quite different. So thank you to our choir for providing the litany today. And I'll say a little bit more about that, but I want to dig into the gospel first. The temptation of Jesus is one of those things where there's three temptations. And I think it is a challenge sometimes to try to figure out, well, what do these mean? Why is Jesus being tempted in these three specific ways? And there's a couple of different ways you could think about it, but I'll offer one. And I think it occurred to me mostly because of the pandemic and the realities of how we've been living the last couple of years that I hadn't thought about the first temptation in this way. So I'll give you an interpretation of it and how it might link to the other two. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days fasting. The devil comes and says, turn the rocks into bread. I had never thought about it this way, but perhaps the temptation was simply for Jesus just to stay in the wilderness and just to continue being alone and never actually get going on his ministry. And I would never have thought that before. But if you think about the last 2 years, it has become surprisingly easy to go into our little sheltered lives, to shut the door, whether it's in our house, but in our own little personal, private fasting wilderness, and just tune everything and everybody else out. And it has proven to be a challenge for many of us in a variety of different ways to come back out of the wilderness. So I think it's a legitimate temptation that Jesus faces to just stay there and not bother dealing with anybody else. It may not be ideal, but at least he doesn't have to do anything. The second one is Jesus is tempted to become a great ruler. He's called again and again, Rabbi, and my Lord, my God, the King of the Son of David, all of these great, and one of them quite regal titles. And the offer from the devil is, well, make it real. Become an earthly king. Here you go. And I think that probably was also a temptation of Jesus, one that he also rejects. The third one is, jump off the temple. I've been told this before, that perform a great miracle. But I actually think it actually points towards the crucifixion. It's the temptation to not suffer any harm, to just let the angels protect him in all that he does, which is frankly contrary to the cross. Without suffering, there is no cross. There's no protection there. He's as raw and naked as you can get. So if you think about those three temptations, they kind of add up. One, to just let it go and be alone and not interact with anybody. Two, to have it your way, to use the Burger King way, to have it your way and be an earthly ruler in the here and now. Or three, to play it safe and be protected in all things. And all three of those are contrary to the ministry that Jesus actually lives out. We never hear the front end story of it, but do you think that Jesus was just a tad concerned when he first went and visited the lepers? I would be. You never know. So I throw those things out there. The temptations that we read every year on Lent 1 are specific to Jesus. But each of us in our lives as Christians also confront temptations, and many of them have to do with being tempted or steered away from the ministry that God has called us to do in the church and in the world. They may take different forms, but it is not all that far off to think of any given thing that you do in terms of your calling as a Christian, to think, number one, maybe today I'm just better off sitting at home and not interacting with anybody. Or number two, maybe I'd like to do it my way so that I get all the glory from this. Or number three, maybe I'm not going to do this because in some way, shape, or form, it might harm me, my reputation, my health, my standing in the world. I need to just play it safe for me. If you think about the different types of ministry that we all do, I think all three of those apply. And I can tell you that I am certainly tempted for all three of those reasons. There's not too many people I know that wouldn't rather just sit at home and do nothing. I don't want to interact with anybody today, thank you very much. I'm going to call this a day of rest. Think in your life what temptations you face and how those temptations prevent you or try to steer you away from the ministry that you are called to do as a faithful Christian, ministering to people in the world in all of the challenges and all of the selflessness and all the time and energy that that takes. There's lots of those temptations. As you move through Lent, try to address them so that you do not get overtaken by those temptations. Number two, the Great Litany always strikes me as shockingly relevant. You may not know this. The Great Litany was the first service that was provided in English post-Reformation to the Church of England. It was the first thing that they published and got out there for use by the people. So it's 500 years old. And the themes that pop up, I mean, who knew 5 years ago that plague was going to be something that was so relevant? Or pestilence? Who knew 2 weeks ago that war was going to be so on the front end when we read through and pray the Great Litany? It is so ancient, and yet nothing is out of date. As I heard the Great Litany today, and as I heard and reflected on the reading from Deuteronomy, which, as an aside, the reading from Deuteronomy is one of, if not the, primary creedal statements for the people of Israel. That line, "My father was a wandering Aramaean." A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor upon us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power, and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. This is one of the primary creedal statements of what it means to be a Jew. Abraham left Aram and was wandering, and his people went down into Egypt where they were enslaved, and they fled and ended up, thank God, in the Promised Land. When I read this and hear the Great Litany, I have to say I can't but help to think very sadly that there are, and counting, 1.5 million refugees fleeing the Ukraine right now. People that are wandering, that have been afflicted and oppressed, that now have no home. And when we read the Great Litany and read and pray about wars, it's real up there in terms of the concern. This is real. And the pain and the devastation and the suffering that is going on in Ukraine to the Ukrainian people who have been invaded by the Russians require some Christian response. Now, there's two things I can think of that we can all do. The first, the Great Litany is a perfect example. We can pray, and we should pray. You should. We all should keep the people of Ukraine in our prayers. Can you imagine 40 million people, over a million and a half refugees fleeing the country? Can you imagine that happening to us? God have mercy on them. When you say your prayers every day, please keep them in your prayers. The second one is a little more hands-on and may require a little more patience. 2 weeks ago, I preached about refugees. It was specifically that we were going to host an event for Hearts and Homes for Refugees who are trying right now to settle some Afghan refugees. Because it does take time when people flee a country for them to finally end up somewhere that might be a place where they can resettle. Do you remember the Afghan crisis? That was the most recent major thing that we had to deal with. Well, refugees are arriving now. We had the Hearts and Homes for Refugees event last Sunday. The opportunity was provided, and it is still there. If you would like to volunteer to help out in any way that you can to resettle refugees, you can go on to Hearts and Homes for Refugees website, and you can sign up and look for ways that you might be able to help. There's small ways and big ways, but I encourage you to do it for two reasons. Afghan refugees need help, and they are resettling in our country and in our area. And in a couple of months, the odds are pretty good that there's going to be a fair amount of Ukrainian refugees that arrive into our country. I wouldn't say it's good practice to start now. I think it's good ministry to start now. And when refugees from Ukraine arrive, and from other places, this is a ministry that you can probably do for your entire life, being involved in helping resettle people. And frankly, you can't get more biblical than that. The story of Israel is the story of refugees coming to the Promised Land. The story of Jesus starts with them fleeing to Egypt and then coming back and settling in Nazareth. So I encourage you, those three things. Don't be tempted away from ministry because you don't have the time or the energy, or because it doesn't give you the glory you want, or because it might be a little unsafe in some way. 2, do please pray for the people of Ukraine. And 3, consider getting involved in hearts and homes for refugees, or some similar way so that your prayers can be turned into action. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.